Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to welcome you on behalf of David, Zev, Mel, Rabbi Ken Chazin, and Carolyn, our judge leadership team. And in honor of Veterans Day, we offer a special expression of gratitude to all of the vets, men and women who have put it all on the line, some paying the ultimate price, fighting for our freedom and for our values. We salute you and we thank you. It's been a heck of a week. I think we can all agree to that. It's been a week full of optimism that soon our country will have new leadership, but also a week wrought with anxiety over the continuing, not very surprising efforts of the current administration to undermine our democracy. President-elect Biden's calm response is a beacon to all of us and surely demonstrates that we have elected the right man at the right time. The task of leading this country in these divided times is monumental. But as so many have pointed out, so many of our speakers and so many pundits we watch on TV, our country has returned from deep division before, and we can surely do it again. Our speakers tonight and for the next several weeks will help us understand those pathways. You will note that we have added Bret Stephens to our December lineup, and in a moment, David will tell you about a special panel we have assembled for a December program as well. Thank you to our many wonderful co-sponsors, Temple Isaiah, Stephen Wise Temple, Valley Beth Shalom, Temple Beth Am, Leo Beck Temple, ICAR, Temple Israel of Hollywood, Jewish Center for Justice, the Holocaust Museum LA, and the Pico Union Project. Now, David.
Thank you, Janice. Over 3 years ago, Janice and I and our two organizations, Jews United and Community Advocates, held our first joint town hall on the dangers of Trump policies and rhetoric. It was precipitated by the administration's family separation and immigration actions. At that meeting, addressed by the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist Bret Stephens, who will be returning to our platform in December, Trump, truth is get away with. Nearly 4 years later, approaching the end of the Trump administration, lies and dishonesty remain an overriding concern. Today, Tom Friedman, also the Times, writes of the damage that has been done to democracy by Trump. He says it is impossible to maintain a free society if leaders and news purveyors feel at liberty to spread lies without sanction. We need to restore the stigma to lying and liars before it's too late. We need to hunt for truth, fight for truth, and mercilessly discredit the forces of disinformation. It is the freedom battle of our generation. Our series has been predicated on the notion that there is indeed an ongoing fight for truth, and that we all have a part to play in that struggle. Our commitment is to keep that effort going, to help assess the damage that has been done by Trump, and to meet the daunting challenges ahead. Next week, we'll have the polling maven, CNN's and the Atlantic's Ron Brownstein, who will be followed by George Will, Adam Schiff, and as Janice mentioned, Bret Stephens. And then on Tuesday, December 15th, a panel of the leading civil rights leaders in the country, the national heads of the NAACP, LULAC, Latin Americans United, and the ADL, to talk about repairing America and restoring intergroup relations after Trump. Each week, it has been an exciting journey. We look forward to many more as we begin to see light at the end of this very long tunnel. Janice?
Yes, now I would like to introduce our speakers tonight. Bill Kristol joins us tonight for a command performance, having addressed our audience this past summer. Bill is a frequent and sought-after commentator on several networks. He was the founder and editor-at-large of the Weekly Standard and is now editor-at-large of The Bulwark, a moderate conservative, though nonpartisan news and opinion website he co-founded with Charlie Sykes. Bill is a founder and director of the advocacy organization Defending Democracy Together and a founder of Republican Voters Against Trump. He has published widely in areas ranging from foreign policy to constitutional law to political philosophy. He has authored several books, including the New York Times bestseller, The War Over Iraq, America's Mission, and Saddam's Tyranny. Mr. Kristol received both his BA and his PhD from Harvard University, and he has taught politics at the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. And because it's Veterans Day today, I just wanted you all to know that Bill's son served in the U.S. Marine Corps in Afghanistan, for which we are grateful. Patt Morrison is also no stranger to our audience, having moderated many of our Wednesday night programs. Patt is a longtime Los Angeles Times writer, columnist, and podcaster who has a share of 2 Pulitzer Prizes. Her broadcasting work has won 6 Emmys and 12 Golden Mike Awards. Both of her nonfiction books have been bestsellers. Rio, LA, her book about the LA River, and Don't Stop the Presses. We're very excited to have you both with us. And now we will turn the program over to Pat and Bill.
Janice, thank you so much. And I'm so happy to be with all of you again. So happy that many of you are here. The last time we all spoke together, well, we may all have had a drink in our hands, a little nervous drink, and now you may have a celebratory one. But still, what can we say? What's the technical term for what we're going through now? WTF? The election is over. Joe Biden is the president-elect. And yet Donald Trump, true to form, is being Donald Trump. The question is what dangers this poses to democracy, what risks it may be sowing right now, like Cadmus teeth for the next administration, and what this means for us domestically and internationally. Bill Kristol, of course, has great expertise in all of this. The questions about whether or not this country really needs to coddle Donald Trump through the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross stages of his election death, at least his present White House death. So, Bill, thank you so much for joining us. Can I hear you there? You're still on mute, Bill.
Sometimes it's better when you unmute yourself. Sometimes it's not. You know? Cuts both ways. Good to be with all of you. Good to be with you, Pat.
So I think everybody's comparing notes on this. What were you doing last Saturday when you heard the news about the election being called for Biden?
I was home, as one often is in this Zoom time. I don't think I was watching TV, though, but I heard about it pretty quickly. It was I mean, I expected it. Obviously, Pennsylvania it just took a while for them to decide to finally call it. But it was an interesting election, though. And I do think you said earlier, you know, we're feeling mixed emotions, perhaps. And I was on with a group and people who had worked against Trump, mostly Republicans against Trump. And a couple of days after the election, someone and the host said, well, what do you all feel? And actually, spontaneously, we all said the same word, which was relief. And I think that's right. And maybe I'll just take a minute to say, because I think it is very good for the country that Donald Trump is very, very unlikely to be president for the next 4 years. I mean, he shouldn't be, he won't be. There's a very tiny chance his really irresponsible gambits could pay off, but we can come back to that if you want, but I don't think they will. So the good news is Joe Biden beat an incumbent president. That doesn't happen often. Incumbents usually win about a little more than 2/3 of the time, actually, when they run for re-election. Not as lost since Carter in '80. And he beat him, it turned out, clearly, I'd say, maybe not quite comfortably. So that's very good news. I mean, I really think, and I think incidentally, you're seeing what a Trump second term would have been like in this last week. Right? I mean, all the barriers would have been gone, all the checks. They would have had a Republican majority in the Senate. It would be Trump cronies running every major agency, even more than has been the case. A real blank check for really a dangerous, really, really dangerous 4 years. The flip side, on the other hand, is it wasn't what I had hoped for, a repudiation of Trumpism, and even not a really blistering repudiation of Trump. He'll lose by about 6 million votes, a little more than 4%. But we're not talking about a kind of landslide. They held the Senate. Republicans were not punished down ballot for defending Trump, for enabling Trump, for rationalizing Trump. They picked up House seats, much to everyone's surprise. I think a couple in California, it looks like, though for some reason California takes an awful long time to count all these ballots. So from my point of view, someone who had some hopes that the Republican Party could liberate itself from Trump and Trumpism, I'm not terribly optimistic about that. And again, look at the last week. How few Republicans have said that what Trump is doing is wrong and really dangerous. A bunch of them have sort of tried to kind of, as usual, keep their head down and say, well, it's complicated, and let people count the votes and let the lawsuits go forward, and try to kind of avoid taking sides. But the Republican National Committee is all on board. A lot of people are with Trump, and he's doing real damage in so many ways. So it is, I think, relief is the right attitude, but our problems are not solved at all. I mean, I think David mentioned something about Tom Friedman had said there should be a stigma for lying, a stigma for disinformation. I wouldn't say that the American public made anyone pay a price, really, if you want to think of it that way, except for Trump himself a little bit, for everything we've gone through over the last 4 years.
Well, some highly placed source has been quoted saying, well, what's the harm of humoring him through a few state voting challenges, which reminded me of Trump campaigning in 2016, telling African Americans, what have you got to lose?
No, I to the degree I'm still speaking to a few Republicans who are, not really pro-Trump, but a little more of the kind of let's just go along and humor him side. I mean, I got very angry, I've got to say, when someone said virtually that was a Washington Post quote, I think, but it was the same thing someone said to me. He's a toddler, just let him play out the
Cry it out.
anxiety and the anger. Who you were saying, the stages agree. If a toddler is playing with matches and there's some gasoline nearby or some, it's not safe. I mean, it's dangerous. Now, is it as dangerous as a guy who's fully ready to burn everything down and has a complete plan of how to do so? No, that would be a really dangerous autocrat or authoritarian or nihilist. But this is dangerous stuff. He's got tens of millions of people. You can see it in some of the polling numbers, believing that our whole electoral system is rigged, that magically somehow, I suppose, votes all over Pennsylvania got stolen, 1 or 2% in each county. I mean, it's really ludicrous. Now, maybe that'll all die down. I mean, that the counter argument is it's bad now, but 3, 6, 9 months from now, it's ancient history, and we kind of go about our business. But again,
Well,
but he will have picked the current Republican chairman to stay on. He'll be a big figure. His people will want his support on the Republican side. So I'm worried that Trump and Trumpism, we have not gotten them out of our politics.
I had predicted, as many people did about a month ago, that if he were to lose, it would be scorched earth for the 10 weeks after that he would issue crazy executive orders. He would place his own people deep inside organizations to do what mayhem they could. And sure enough, we have challenges that seem not to be about undoing the election, but about destabilizing people's faith in democracy. We have top people at the DOD being kicked out and being replaced by Trump loyalists, which you describe as the loyalty oath Trump loyalists. So in these critical positions at this critical time, when they are lame ducks, but they still have 10 weeks to go, what do you see as the plan, or is there a plan?
So again, if you talk to people, and I've actually tried to follow this one pretty closely in the last 24, 36 hours, who know Defense Department well, people who served under Bush or President or Obama, or for that matter, served in the earlier years of Trump under Jim Mattis, and some of them stayed into this year to try to keep things steady at the Defense Department. They're pretty worried, I would say. I mean, it's a big place, and it can kind of run itself, and the uniformed military will do its thing. And so if these guys just sit there enjoying the perks of being big shots for 70 days, we can live with that. But they aren't that type. They want to sort of advance a kind of create bizarre version of a Trump agenda, America first, and so forth. So we could have a lot of rash decisions. Now, hopefully, they'll be limited in their impact. A lot of them could be reversed, presumably, by the Biden administration. But the Defense Department is not a place you want to mess around with, having people who are way out of their depth, some of them really kind of crazy, honestly, with conspiracy mindsets, doing things. I think a lot of the civilian and uniformed employees at DOD will resist doing anything that's wrong, but then we'll have crises, throughout the building. And I mean, it's going to be, it's one thing to, sort of do some silly things, try to stash your people in the bowels of the Commerce Department or the Education Department or something. Every administration does a little of that, but this kind of decapitation at the Defense Department. And again, some people thought, well, maybe he just doesn't like Esper. Esper wouldn't go along with him on several things. To Esper's credit, I've been critical of him, but I'd say he did stand up on some things. But he didn't just get rid of Esper. He got rid of the intelligence chief. He got rid of the policy chief. He's got a White House attorney now in as the counsel at NSA. That gets you a little worried. I mean, large parts of the military and intelligence establishment are now being run by total Trump loyalists. I mean, the degree to which these people have no qualification, but being over the top loyalists is amazing. And it's very much controlled by the White House, and not by even any responsible people at the White House, if there are still some, but by the 30-year-old personnel director, Johnny McEntee, and by Meadows, and by O'Brien, the national security advisor. I mean, it's really, John Bolton, as I disapproved of a lot of he has done, but one wishes that someone who had some sense of responsibility like Bolton. I'll just tell one quick story that might bring it home to people. And several people on this call, many, I'm sure, served in the military and know or follow things in the military. So there's a tradition at the Pentagon when a senior person, either in the military or on the civilian side, on his last day, if he or she wishes this, they're clapped out of the building. You've seen this on TV. They come down on the riverside in the entrance, and everyone assembles who wishes to, and they clap as the person leaves. And it's a nice kind of moving ceremony. Jim Anderson, Army guy, long time defense and intelligence community civilian official, worked for Trump, but was always regarded as a responsible person in there. He was fired on Tuesday as Undersecretary for Policy, and for him, it meant a lot. Being clapped out, it was kind of the capstone of his career in and around the military. So they did the ceremony for him. They were happy to. I think he's respected in the building. About 20 minutes later, the White House Personnel Office called over to one of the Trump loyalists in the Pentagon, saying they wanted to know any political appointee who joined in the crowds and the groups that stood in the hallway and on the steps to clap out Jim Anderson, because they wanted to fire any Trump appointee, any political appointee who had done that. I mean, the degree of pettiness and vindictiveness and really just idiocy of that, it tells you something, though, about who's now running the US government for 70 days.
If you were just to plug in the name of a different country and a different leader, it would simply be very clearly dictatorship, retribution, the sort of thing that we've prided ourselves on not doing.
It would be issuing statements, warning and worrying about that country's democratic path, worrying about, are they going to accept the election results, worrying about the kinds of people who are now in charge of major parts of the government. I agree.
Well, to that end, some time ago, I don't know if it's weeks or days, things tend to run together in this COVID shutdown. You quoted from David Frum's book, if conservatives become convinced they cannot win democratically, they will not abandon conservatism, they will reject democracy, which is chilling a prospect, which we're seeing come to fruition now, as I can imagine.
I mean, David wrote that, I think, in 2018, and I, at the time, thought he's overdoing it and stating it a little bit. But I mean, the number of conservatives, I would argue they're not real conservatives, but they say they are, so they are in the current context, I guess, who were just pretty much flat out saying, these legislatures should just appoint different slates of electors based on an incredibly tenuous and false reading of constitutional provision, ignoring all kinds of state and federal laws anyway, because who cares what the voters said? It's a little murky. There might be some fraud. There is some fraud, they say. And so we're just going to disregard the results that we certified by the Board of Elections or the Secretaries of State in various states, which are pretty professional operations and are pretty careful. And we're just going to try to go to this incredibly anti-democratic expedient that's really never been done. 1876 is the one case where there were some competing slates of electors, and that was very complicated. And it was worked out, but that was a long time ago. I mean, it's really extraordinary that they're going to this length, or that it's even being discussed as a respectable alternative, and not just in the most fever swamp places, but on Fox and kind of the Wall Street Journal editorial page. Probably shouldn't do it, kind of unwise, but in a pinch,
but planting the seed. But planting the seed, the idea of it.
Totally. And I've seen myself just in the last 3-6 months, how much it's gone from being just a kind of totally crazy conspiracy, fever swamp kind of idea to something that, the Republican leaders of the Assembly and the Senate in Pennsylvania had said ahead of the election, we're not interested in that. It's ridiculous. Now they're getting pummeled by some voters in Pennsylvania. And I saw one of them said, well, we certainly shouldn't do it unless there's extraordinary circumstances. So you can see the erosion. This is why I'm a little bit on the alarmist side. I'm not totally alarmist. I don't think it's going to happen, but we need to be alert. And also people need to push back. And people in Pennsylvania, they don't need to go into the streets, but they need to make clear that this would be totally unacceptable. Now, there are some Republicans doing the right thing, the Secretary of State of Georgia, but the number of Republican voices, Pat Toomey, the senator from Pennsylvania, spoke up this morning. That was good. But the number of Republican voices who are really speaking up in a serious way for democracy, for following the will of the people when it's been pretty clearly expressed according to the rules that were agreed to, that were in place beforehand, is really astonishing.
Have these Republicans, Mitch McConnell, others in the Senate, wherever you want to find them, become just as transactional as Donald Trump, abandoning democratic principles, constitutional principles in favor of whatever will gain them?
I mean, yes, and to a considerable degree, and then they'll privately say, well, they're kind of constraining him in certain ways. But what's the excuse now? He's lost the election. So let's take an example from just a few weeks ago, which seems like months ago or years ago, the confirmation of Justice Amy Coney Barrett. So that was a clear case where they were totally hypocritical. They said they would never confirm someone and shouldn't confirm a nominee in an election year, and then they promptly rammed her through in record speed, actually, or record in closer to election day than any other justice, I believe, has ever been confirmed. So that was bad, in my opinion. It wasn't good for the country, but they did it. But then you thought, okay, that's McConnell's crowning achievement. They got their majority more or less on the court, and now they're over, they've done what they had to do, and now they'll kind of get responsible. But sure enough, here we are, a week after the election, and they're not being much more responsible. And that's where I really worry about the future, because if one of our two major parties is this willing to be anti-democratic, this willing to just break the rules, to be, as you say, transactional or opportunist in terms of even the most basic norms and of behavior, that's not good.
A lot of people thought that Republicans would come out from under their Stockholm syndrome and welcome the opportunity, and indeed the political cover that the Biden election would provide to them, say, well, it's over, it's time to come on out. We've seen this in leaders in other nations saying our long international nightmare is over. So how does the United States at this point position itself, and how does it look in the eyes of our allies? Are we going back to some primus inter pares relationship like we had? Could Trump, even in the meantime, take us out of NATO, take us out of the United Nations? You talk about a perilous time. This is it for our allies as well.
Yeah, no, I think there are constraints. I mean, both within the executive branch and in Congress, and on some of these things, and some of them could be reversed pretty quickly. So one hopes that wiser heads prevail. I mean, one thing though is, I think, again, to come back, David, I was struck when he quoted Tom Friedman on stigma. There has to be a little stigma going along with this. I'm not for persecuting everyone who works in the Trump administration by any means, or everyone who works in the Trump White House, or every lawyer who represents the Trump campaign. But at some point, if you're just going along with this, what are you doing? I mean, how much damage are you doing to the country? So I think it's important that we put up whatever barriers we can over these next 2+ months. I'm reasonably optimistic that we make it through without terrible, hopefully, consequences. It does leave more work for Joe Biden to do. The good news is, I think he was just vice president 4 years ago. He knows the government. If this transition gets going a little later than it would for someone else, it's not going to honestly matter that much. I see he just appointed today, or at least it's being reported, that Ron Klain is going to be chief of staff. He's been in the Clinton and the Obama administrations. He knows what he's doing. They have a good chance to get off to a pretty good start. Hopefully with the progress of the vaccine and some actual serious public health measures, though I'm very worried about the next 2 months, I think Biden has a pretty good chance to have some real success, some real improvements, unfortunately from a very bad start, low base on COVID. And that would be good. I mean, frankly, it's in the country's interest that Joe Biden be a successful president. I mean, ultimately, we can all argue 4 years from now whether we want to go in a more conservative or liberal direction or whatever, a new generation. But it would be bad. I mean, it's important, in my view, that he succeed. And so it's important for me that Republicans who can help do help. And one of the big questions, and this I'm more pessimistic than I was a week ago because of the way they behave, but you can write a scenario where Mitch McConnell and quite a lot of Republicans decide, they could work with Biden on a bunch of issues. What's the point of just stopping stuff? I mean, and McConnell and Biden have cut deals in the past, but I'm worried also. I did this conversation with Ron Brownstein, which is online. People can watch if they want as a kind of warm up for next week with Ron, and he's looking at the voters of each party. They're more separate than they've ever been. The trench between the two parties, between red America and blue America, is deeper and wider than it's been. If you just look at the vote, Trump got his vote up, Democrats got their vote up. There were a few swing voters, and we helped, and others helped to bring over from Trump or from staying home to Biden. That probably made the difference in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and a couple other states. But basically, the country, they're more entrenched than ever, both sides. And unless some politicians show leadership, and we will get into a kind of World War I trench warfare, which did not work out well in World War I, and does not work out well in politics. Now, it's also true that in an evenly divided nation, sometimes that's an opportunity for compromise, for creative thinking, for younger members of Congress and others to step forward and do things together, because it's evenly balanced. So you could have one of those gangs of 8, the kind McCain and others used to have, and work together across the aisle. Susan Collins got reelected. People might be disappointed about that a little bit in some ways, but on the other hand, she is the type who would seek to do this. It can loop around the Democratic side. So I go back and forth just trying to think. I think we don't know. We don't know But good leadership could make this a pretty good year or two for the country. But lack of leadership and more on the Republican side, frankly, could make this a pretty ugly year. I'll just make one more point. I say this as a Republican or ex-Republican or something, recovering Republican, I don't know. But, there's a lot of, both parties are dug in, both parties have extremes, red America, blue America, and that's all true to some degree. But really the what's the word I'm looking for? The guilt or the responsibility is not symmetrical in this case. It's asymmetrical. It's the Republican, it's Donald Trump with the aid of much of the Republican Party is calling the whole legitimacy of the elections into question, is ginning people up, is being totally irresponsible. And the Democrats are just treating, they're behaving responsibly so far as I know. I don't see huge efforts by the Democratic National Committee to challenge close congressional elections. They won some, they lost some. They won some Senate races, they lost some Senate races. Susan Collins is at, I don't know what she had, 50.7% or something in Maine. If she were below 50, there would be a ranked choice voting kind of thing, and that might help her opponent. No one's going around screaming that there's 0.7% fraud in Maine, right? I mean, they conceded the election, I believe. So the degree of irresponsibility on the Republican side is bad.
When Ron Brownstein is here next week, he'll get into some of the details about voting patterns and Latino voting, Black voting, and religious voting, and that sort of thing. But as a prelude to the next question, do you think the anti-Trumpers like you, the Lincoln Project efforts, did they make any difference? Did they move any Republican votes into the Biden column?
I mean, it's hard to prove, obviously. We try. So Lincoln Project, I would say, I think Lincoln Project did some great stuff. They did a very dramatic ads. They got in Trump's head. They ginned up, actually, honestly, they got a lot of liberals even more worked up and energized, which is very important, as we saw in a state like Georgia, really made a difference. They didn't succeed in knocking off Republican senators, which is one of the things they tried to do. I have no problem with that. They just didn't work. So you can't really, that happens in life, in politics. We had this, had the different tactic or strategy, complementary, I would say, of really trying to very precisely go after these people who had voted for Trump in 2016, or in some cases stayed home, or were lifelong Republicans, and persuade them to either not vote for Trump or vote for Biden in most cases in 2020. And so the message, if you looked at any of our videos on our website, was a kind of, look, I understand why you might have been tempted to vote for Trump, or I'm a voter who voted for Trump. I thought he might shake things up. I thought he was a businessman. I thought we needed change. I didn't like Hillary Clinton. But we can't do 4 more years of this. It's too divisive, or he's messed up the pandemic, or people had different reasons for abandoning it. We had a lot of pro-life Republicans saying, I'm pro-life and I'm still pro-life. And I wish Biden were pro-life, but he's not. But nonetheless, in the big scheme of things, it's very important that Trump not have a second term, and that overcomes, in this case, being closer to the Republicans on this particular issue. So we had much more of a, instead of hitting them over the head with a stick, kind of trying to get people like them to say that they were changing their minds. And there is data, so this is sort of interesting. In 2016, 4%, I don't know who they were exactly, 4% of Hillary voters in 2016 went to Trump this time. I think a lot of them he picked up a little vote among African Americans, especially African American men, among Hispanics, as I think you mentioned. Anyway, that all added up to 4%. Small number, but of course, it makes a big difference if you're winning a state or losing a state by 0.6 or 1.4. 8% of Trump 2016 voters went over to Biden. So we doubled the movement. 8 minus 4 is 4. That would have made the difference in a lot of key states. It's obviously not entirely due to anything we did. A lot of people were just making up their own minds. But I think those swing voters made a big difference. It's a very big, there are 2 huge camps on each side, pretty evenly divided. It's trench warfare, but it turns out if you're having an election that's pretty evenly divided, a few groups on the margin can make a difference.
We know what the left wing of the Democratic Party looks like. You've got Bernie Sanders, you've got Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and other members of Congress. But what does the right look like now? Is it the QAnon candidate from Georgia or Florida? Is it Lindsey Graham saying that we have to do something about this mail-in voting or we'll never have Republicans elected again? Is this big sort very clear? And with the Republicans, is it a rear guard action demographically, or do they have substantial ground that they're standing on that they can expand?
So 2 points. I mean, Ron, we should talk to Ron. You should let Ron talk more about that latter point. I think I put it this way, Ron talks about a coalition of transformation. That's kind of the Democrats, future-oriented, more diverse, younger, and a coalition of restoration, older, typically white, often non-college educated, maybe yearning, as Trump said, make America great again. We're yearning for a friendlier to America of the past than the America. They don't like the way things are moving, the trends towards the future. I think Ron would say this himself, that people have been a little too overconfident that all the numbers are on the side of the coalition of transformation. They are mostly on the side of that coalition. The country's becoming more diverse. Obviously, a certain number of older voters age out, as we like to say politely, of the electorate every 4 years, and younger voters come in. So, you know, in a way, the Democrats have a slight winning hand, you might say, a slight advantage. But these coalitions aren't set in stone. And if Hispanics go from 27% Republican to 34%, and if non-college educated whites go from 67 to 73, Republicans can win. And they did win a lot of House seats, and that's really how they won them. So I'd say the coalitions are more evenly balanced than a lot of Democrats had hoped. Another way of putting it is this: in 2018, when Democrats picked up 41 House seats, they won the national House vote by about 8.5 million votes. I think it's almost, but that's about the same, about 9% of the vote. It looks like Democrats will have won the national House vote this time by about 2%. Biden's going to beat Trump by about 4%. Republicans ran ahead of Trump. So the Democrats only won the national House vote by 2%. So if you want a snapshot of the country, there are a few more Democrats than Republicans, but not a massive number. And it means you have a closely divided House and a closely divided Senate, with the Senate tilting Republican because of the demographics of the way the Senate is set up.
What does this mean, that we're not going to see what one of the hopes of the Biden presidency was, that here's a moderate who has worked across the aisles before and can do so again? Are the Republicans going to be folding their arms and saying, we can't afford to do that? We can't lose face with the people at home and our colleagues?
And they could. And I do think here, the question you asked that I didn't answer just before was sort of, the right wing of the Republican Party. It is conspiratorialist. It is influenced by Fox News and even beyond Fox News now, incidentally. And the degree, therefore, of now, could Republicans stand up to that and still be reelected in primaries with 60, 70%? Sure, I think so. But they get intimidated. They're quiet. They endorse the candidate who's acute. I mean, in Georgia, which is up in 2 months, obviously, runoffs in both races. Kelly Loeffler is, a very, very wealthy businesswoman and the wife of a very prominent businessman. Totally conventional, if I can put it this way, wealthy Republican business type. No history of involvement in extremist groups or anything. Her politics may not be to the taste of most people.
To the right of Attila the Hun.
Well, yeah, right. But her politics may never have been to the taste of people on this call, but they were just kind of normal, wealthy Republican politics, if I could put it that way, country club Republicans, and actually fairly, probably a little bit progressive and tolerant, I would even say, on a lot of the social issues. And now she's embracing the QAnon candidate in Georgia who will become a member of Congress. And she's sounding like everything Trump says, she echoes it. Because, of course, she really doesn't believe it, I don't think. She echoes it in a way that sounds even weirder and almost tinnier than an authentic, crazy right-wing nativist populist. So that really is bad. You mentioned Bernie Sanders earlier, and I'm the last person to defend Bernie, I don't think would be a good president, and I don't agree with that a lot of things. But Bernie Sanders doesn't go around calling our elections into question. He didn't go around spending 3 months after, there's a lot of griping after Trump won and the electoral college is bad. But at the end of the day, Bernie Sanders, okay, that's the way the system works. And the same with AOC and others, they're not. So, I mean, they do a little more of that than I would like, but the disparity between the two parties now, between the strength of extremism in the Republican Party, is really great. That's one of the things that worries me the most about the next 4 years. Now, having said that, Biden is a good politician. Not every Republican is, interested in QAnon. Some of them, Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania has 2 more years. He's retiring. He probably would like to work with Biden on some trade issues, or conceivably on an immigration deal. He had been working on that back in 2013 and legalizing the Dreamers. Could Biden make some deals? Can he tell some liberals, look, we can't do everything we want to do on some of these issues, but we can do some good things? And then can he get enough Republicans? I think that's a huge question for the next, maybe the biggest question for American politics for the next year. Can Biden win over some Republicans? Are Republicans willing to be won over? on some of these issues. The pandemic, honestly, is a terrible thing, but it's a good issue to begin with, because there is a lot of, I mean, who's against, you'd think, who's against being healthy and getting healthier, who's against,
Who was against masks? You could have
who they
asked.
are against masks. So that's an interesting question. I mean, how much will the mask craziness go away after Trump? That's a good, like, little test case, right? I mean, will people still be, is that all just Trump? And then once Trump goes away and stops saying it over every day, people decide, I don't know what that is.
Isn't that a question for the template of the Republican Party? How much is too much? I mean, will children in cages be an issue? Will, I don't know, pick any horror of the last 4 years and say, what is too far now? Has it stretched, like old underwear, has it stretched out so far that it won't matter to try to come back, that those issues will no longer be even in play? Nobody can be outraged by them any longer.
And one thing that might help, so I haven't seen the latest returns from California, from Southern California, where it looks like there might be 1 or 2 Republican pickups. So if the Republicans win a couple of Democratic seats or hold a couple of contested ones, win an open seat or 2, those will be by definition swing seats. You'd think those Republicans might be willing to work on legalizing the Dreamers. They're not going to sound like a liberal Democrat in terms of, the overall pattern of immigration, perhaps. Maybe, the QAnon lady from Georgia is not going to be interested in working with them. And will some Republicans decide, both for their own political advantage, but also for the sake of the country, to really be different? I mean, or will the entire California delegation sound like the 2 or 3 most reactionary members who have just been the loudest members over the last 2, 3, 4 years?
Do you think that if it had not been for the COVID crisis, that Donald Trump would have won re-election?
I'm not sure. It probably would have helped him. We were struck by this in the focus groups we did, though, at Republican Voters Against Trump. People didn't blame Trump for COVID or for the mismanagement of COVID nearly as much as they should have, in my opinion. But we found this over and over with swing voters. It's sort of like, he's been a little ridiculous, but it was a very hard thing to deal with. Every country messed it up more somehow or other. And those public health people, they do want to shut things down too much. There was a lot of sympathy for Trump's position. I mean, it was a very cartoon version of the position, not on masks. They thought that was kind of just crazy and him being crazy, but that somehow they did do a pretty good job, the Republicans, of stereotyping, you might say, the public health officials as being too ready to shut everything down. And a lot of people obviously were hurting in their small businesses or in their jobs and so forth. And so there was it cut less against Trump than one might have thought. It's amazing. The result we have, which is about 4.4% Democratic Biden win, is exactly the result what the polls were suggesting before the pandemic hit.
Wow.
So you would have thought a pandemic and a recession, that might make you more inclined to chuck the incumbent out. Maybe it did a little bit. Maybe it made a difference of 2 points, which would have been decisive. But it's amazing to me. I guess as an American, I am a little shaken that 72 million or so Americans voted to re-elect Trump, much more than in 2016. This is, I was saying in describing the Republican voters against Trump, he was the candidate of change. People could have told themselves, he's being irresponsible now, but when he gets into office, he'll be more serious. He'll be constrained by the Republicans on the Hill. He'll have serious people like Jim Mattis, Secretary of Defense. He's a little bit of a vulgar guy and a kind of a creepy guy in certain ways, but we can live with that, and maybe he'll do some good things. That was at least plausible in 2016. Personally, after watching him as president for 4 years, the idea that so many people were willing to say, fine, let's have another 4 years with actually the guardrails decreased or gone. I find that a little unnerving. Now, you can have a lot of excuses and reasons why people came to that view, and I don't mean to judge 72 million Americans or something, but I am a little, I don't know, I find that unnerving.
Let's take some questions. And I think a lot of people were just as gobsmacked by that as you, that once you knew what you were dealing with, it was a surprise, to say the least, that people said, yes, give us more of it. A lot of questions, and you can put your questions in the chat box for Bill Kristol. A lot of questions about what you think is going to happen in the Georgia Senate races, which now seem to be the focus and maybe one of the reasons behind the Trump administration and other Republicans refusing to concede the election.
It's funny. So there were 2 races, both of which, one is a special race for a partial term to finish up the term of a senator who retired because of bad health, and the other is the regular race. And so it's Ossoff and Warnock, the 2 Democrats. against Loeffler, whom I've mentioned already, and Perdue,
And
the incumbent senator who was elected. Right now, if you add up their vote, well, Georgia's very, very close. We know Biden won it by 12, 14,000 votes. If you add up the votes in each of those Senate races of the candidates who trailed and the third parties, there's a tiny bit of a Republican advantage. It's Republicans ran ahead of Trump in most parts of the country. So, which is interesting, it's as if they got the benefit of the extra Trump turnout, but then a few swing voters, including some of our Republican voters against Trump, decided, well, if Biden's going to be president, would prefer to check Biden a little bit and let's let McConnell be majority leader. And that historically and traditionally, I think most people would say that's going to be dominant in Georgia. I mean, it's a pretty conservative state. They haven't elected a Democrat for Senate since 2000. And, it's a pretty easy appeal, especially as the election gets resolved, presumably in the next month, to say, you don't want Biden and Schumer to be just running roughshod. They'll just implement AOC's agenda. It's all a little ridiculous, like Chuck Schumer and John Hickenlooper and, are just going to be Dianne Feinstein, are going to be just rabid left wingers. But nonetheless, that might work in Georgia. So I'd say of the two candidates, Warnock has a better chance. I mean, he led his runoff and he's running against Loeffler, who was appointed to the seat. I think Ossoff has more of an uphill struggle against Perdue, who was elected once. But, I don't know, but just you mentioned that seems to be one reason why McConnell's going along with Trump's craziness and they all want to gin up their base. I would have expected, I think I said this the day after the election, I don't know, that could be a force for moderation, right? Because it's not like every voter in Georgia is a Trumpy rabble rouser. There are a heck of a lot of moderately conservative businessmen and women in the Atlanta area who want a traditional establishment Republican. You think they might be put off by this, but it does tell you a lot, and it tells you something that's not encouraging about the Republican Party, that they think their incentive is to be more responsible, not less.
Let's try to get to more questions so we can get briefer answers. And here's a question from Barbara about whether the left of the Democratic Party scared off voters for Trump. And we did hear anecdotally that the idea of socialist Joe Biden surprisingly resonated with voters who you think would know Joe Biden well enough to know that that was not the case.
I think they did a good job, the Republicans and Fox and social media platforms, of a kind of cartoonish account of the Democrats, which scared people. I mean, some of it was a little more, they are going to raise taxes on the wealthy. So if that's all you care about, and if you're wealthy, a 3 or 5% increase in your marginal tax rate, you vote, maybe you don't care about all the other things Trump's doing and the damage he's doing. You vote for the Democrat. But again, for me, it's therefore, we were saying this before, the fact that these kinds of considerations outweighed the damage Trump was doing for the country, I find a little unnerving. But there was a little bit of successful scaring people away from the Democrats.
Mehdi is in the UK and wonders whether the Republican Party laid the groundwork for the rise of Trump with the Tea Party at all. And I was even thinking you were a fan of Sarah Palin's, and certainly she had a cult following. Is there now more of a cultish nature to some Republican leaders, even than some Democrats who have big fan followings, but nobody's out in the street wearing military gear and carrying semi-automatic weapons?
Yeah, but I would think of the Palin thing, which I was a tiny bit involved in. I was for Lieberman as the bold pick for McCain. He didn't want to do that. So then I said, well, maybe you just throw the Hail Mary on Palin. She seemed like a popular governor of Alaska, who I didn't realize how much she was not up to the job. But for all of her cult following, it totally disappeared in about 6 months after they lost. It's not like Sarah Palin was a big figure in the Republican Party by 2011 or 2012. The Tea Party had a bigger impact, obviously. But even there, by the party nominated Romney and Ryan in 2012. So I guess yes, certainly there were all kinds of elements there that some of us probably didn't. We looked away from. We fought some of them, Pat Buchanan and Ron Paul. We defeated them, we thought. Trump was really a master at finding all these things that were sort of lurking in the underbrush, bringing them to the fore, energizing those people. And so I think it turned out there was a lot more Trumpiness ahead of Trump, ahead of Trump's emergence in the Republican Party. But Trump was a pretty effective demagogue at mobilizing it. And maybe there's a lesson there that's always a bit of a danger in democracies. But no, in retrospect, there were aspects of the Republican Party. I'm not sure what we could have done about it. I mean, exactly, we all fought those aspects, we thought, but that were more there to be exploited by Trump.
Alan would like to know, and as many people would, I think, how influential Trump is going to be both in the Republican Party and I think beyond it, when you've got a Fox and OAN audience out there still eager, still clamoring for what it is he's selling.
You know, it's one of the big questions. It's related to the other big question we were talking about. Okay, let's assume, I don't know, Biden and McConnell do come to some agreement tentatively on something. If Trump attacks it, total sellout, Mitch has gone establishment, it's an outrage. How many voters stick with, does Mitch stick with the agreement? Do 40 Republican senators stick with it? 20, 10, 5? It's a very good question, both about the Republican Party, the conservative base, and you know how much damage that can be done to the country. Part of me thinks, you know, your ex-president's not the same as being president. I mean, so the positive side of it is, right now he is president and he's doing a lot of damage, potentially a lot of damage. 6 months from now, no Air Force One, fine, he's got his own jet, but no secret service, well, very limited secret service. You know, just putting on these rallies, the amount of help you have by being the incumbent president, by being able to use the resources of the White House is huge, or the U.S. government and the flyovers and this and that, right? And, you know, and announcing a grant from the Department of Commerce for this, and, you know, all that goes away. And maybe 6-9 months from now, to use the Sarah Palin example, maybe there's a little bit of a kind of, well, that, you know, I don't really care about him anymore. Well, that would be to be hoped for.
Diana asked something that we alluded to at the outset of this, which is what damage Trump has done to the foreign policy realm, what damage he might do, and to what extent Biden, partly because of who he is, but partly because of actions that he can take, restore these relationships and restabilize what Trump has done, the damage he's done.
You know, I think, leaving aside what might happen over the next 2 months, and let's just hope not too much does, and that our enemies don't try to take advantage of us, I think Biden has a pretty good chance to restore things or renew things in a new way. Our allies have been pretty good. They've sort of had the attitude for these last 4 years of, we're just going to have to make it through these 4 years, and we're not going to try to pick fights with Trump. I actually give them quite a lot of credit. You know, Merkel and Macron, Theresa May, and then Johnson. I mean, Abe in Japan. I mean, God knows what they think of Trump, but they've sort of thought, you know what, we can't just let the U.S.-led alliances, the liberal world order, crumble here. So we're just going to have to swallow hard and try to put up with this. So I think Biden has actually a bit of an opportunity in foreign policy.
Do you think that these countries now have been snake bit by this incredible Trump aberration, and think it may not be an aberration at all? So maybe we have to reshift our focus from the United States to ourselves again.
I think that's absolutely the right question, Pat. And you know, so I think they will think that to some degree, and they'll be right to think that. Or any of us, can we just sit here and confidently say that, you know, Trumpism will never reappear in the next 4 or 8 or 12 years and dominate the country or win a presidency again? Having said that, I think they have such a stake in the U.S.-led liberal order, they can't really do it themselves, or at least it's very hard for them to. They're looking at Russia, they're looking at China, they're looking at other challenges. And I think they will, in that respect, they'll hope for the best. They'll decide that if they can help Biden be successful, honestly, it minimizes the chances of both Trump or someone defeating Biden in 2024. But more importantly, it takes a little bit of the steam out of the Trumpism, even on the Republican side, and lets a more responsible Republican emerge. So I think their incentives are to try to make this work and not to pull away from the U.S.
During his campaign and thereafter, the Trump audience chant and his own was "lock her up" about Hillary Clinton. That's not what we do in this country. We don't go after our political enemies. And yet after Watergate, we put an attorney general in prison. We put a White House chief of staff in prison and other people. Is there room for some prosecution of blatant law breaking of members of this Trump administration, not for little things like a $36,000 dining room set, but clear violations of constitutional and legal principles?
I mean, I'm of 2 minds of that, like most people are, I suspect. On the one hand, what you mentioned was good, that people were held accountable. On the other hand, Ford pardoned Nixon. And I think most people now, like Teddy Kennedy said before he died, that he had been very, very critical of that at the time, but he thought it was probably the right thing to do for the country. So there are competing considerations here. I would say, though, it's very important, it seems to me, for the Biden administration, and I think Biden understands this, of course, to make clear this will be entirely done by career people in the Justice Department investigating different things if there are credible evidence of problems, and when he's not going to get involved, and I think he should ask his politically appointed AG to even recuse him or herself and so forth. I think at the state level that more stuff could happen, but again, those people honestly, for now in the Democratic Party, it's great to beat your chest and say we're going to lock him up in New York, but that's not healthy really either. It should be, in fact, Cuomo, the New York Attorney General, should say, you know what, we're going to investigate this like any other businessman or any other real estate person. If there's fraud, and we'll prosecute it. But we're not going to treat him any differently. I think bending over backwards to be rule of law-ish is important.
So there's a difficult line to walk, to be holding people accountable in a country of laws and not of men, and yet making it look vengeful, not making it look vengeful, rather. Yeah. Alan, I think it's Alan who was asking, yes, would you consider forming a third party? I don't think he means you, presidential candidate Bill Kristol, but the idea of the dissatisfied Republicans and maybe some moderate Democrats, depending on what the next 4 years holds. Is there any room? We've always talked about it in this country, and it never seems to have come much to fruition. You had a fling with Perot, you had Bull Moose with Teddy Roosevelt. Nothing comes of it.
The system and history both have aspects that militate against it being successful. I'm very much in favor of an independent centrist force, coalition, maybe on particular issues, maybe on a bunch of issues, maybe an umbrella, maybe a group that could help. For example, I was talking to some donors about this, help a moderate Republican here and help a moderate Democrat there. You don't have to just give to one party or the other. So I think I'm very interested in that. I think that's quite promising and would be one way to try to change a little bit the dynamics of the trench warfare in both parties. Ultimately, could you get to a real third party? I think it's less impossible than I would have said 4 or 8 years ago. I think if the Republican Party continues in this direction, if let's say, Biden's a one-term president and maybe isn't so successful and the left really sort of goes into the ascendancy of the Democratic side, there are a lot of Americans who aren't comfortable with either nativist politics on the one hand, or semi-socialist, if you want to use that term, politics on the other, identity politics, cancel culture on the other. So I think there is a chance for a big center. How it manifests itself institutionally, organizationally, politically, I think that's a huge open question.
Before we begin to wrap up, McConnell's goal has been all along, it seems, to get a conservative court up and down the federal court system. And this is something that neocons have talked about as well, as something to be accomplished. How do you think that's gone for the Trump appointees? We look at a Supreme Court that under Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, did not gut Obamacare a few years ago and looks like it's not going to do it again now. So what is the judicial legacy that we're looking at here, and what does it bode for the future, especially overturning things like Roe versus Wade, which has been the law of the land for more than 40 years?
Yeah, huge question, obviously, and I think a lot will depend on the decisions of these individual justices and circuit court judges. I think, I really don't know. I mean, I hope I think Chief Justice Roberts has been a very good example, actually, of someone who's tried to be a sort of a statesman as well as a judge, which you probably should be as Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. It's not just a matter of applying the black letter law quite the way it is at the criminal court level or whatever. And we'll see how some of these other justices behave and whether they think more in a broader way about their responsibilities. So, I mean, I do think if they try to overturn Roe, for example, or do some really dramatic stuff in the next year or two, I do think Democrats would feel with some justice that when they have the Senate, if they get it again, they would want to move towards actual, if not court packing or court expanding, at least forms of judicial reform. That's off the table, presumably, unless they win both Georgia seats. And even so, I don't think you could do it with a 50-50 Senate, and you would need Manchin and so forth. So, I mean, I think in a way it's good. I'm hopeful that the anger dies down, that the courts step back and don't invite, trouble by going every last mile on the kind of conservative judicial agenda. I think it would be healthier for the country, honestly. And, if they want to err a little more on the side of religious freedom in some of these cases, and, which are sort of judgment calls, I think, of how to balance different rights, that will be one thing. Overturning 50-year-old precedents, really radically changing the kind of balance of powers in the country, that would be another.
We have about a minute, which we will give to you to summarize all of this tremendous sweep of American history of the last couple of weeks and the 10 weeks ahead of us.
I guess I'd say this. I was struck by the introduction into this meeting. You all got organized, to do this group, but of course, in so many other ways, people got organized over the last 2-3 years. I think my main message would be, you can't just stop. There's a huge amount to be done, both in stopping some bad things from happening, but also helping get some good things through, and then looking at obviously the next couple of elections, but also looking at what happens in Congress. A lot of people got all revved up. I don't blame them. I was revved up too, at a real horror of what was happening under Trump. I think assuming Biden wins, as I said earlier, we can be relieved that we've sort of avoided the worst outcome, but there's a heck of a lot of work still to be done.
Bill, Kristol, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to talk to you again, and I'm sure the audience had a lot of his questions answered, but many questions remain to be resolved that we will see answered in the weeks ahead. And we want to remind you that coming up, we have next Wednesday's program, my friend Ron Brownstein at CNN and The Atlantic with Larry Mantle, and that's going to be followed by George Will with Warren Olney, and then Congressman Adam Schiff, our local congressman, reelected, of course, to Congress. And so we'll hear more about that. So next week for Ron Brownstein. And thank you to all the organizers and to all of you who watched and listened and submitted your questions, because this is vital to this kind of forum. Thanks very much. Good night.